On July 26, 1991, 4 bodies were found in 3 separate locations in St. Louis, Missouri. The police immediately believed the murders were connected based on one simple fact. All of the victims were members of the same family. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. Please check my show notes for 2 in-person events I will be at this year. The first is the True Crime Podcast Festival in Denver in July. I'm going to be there with a ton of other podcasters and YouTube creators. Stephanie Harlow's going to be there and John Lorden. They're best known for their YouTube channels. And then podcasters like The Defense Diaries, Wine and Crime, True Crime Cases with Lainey, and so many more. And then in October, I will be at the Berkshire Podcast Festival, which is in Northwest Massachusetts. Fall in New England is the absolute best, and I cannot wait to go. There we are going to have Already Gone, Bob Ruff and Janet Varney from Truth and Justice, the doctors from LA Not So Confidential, as well as, of course, the host of the event, Josh Hallmark from True Crime BS. You can check out my episode description where I have links to both of those events, and you can see the full lineups to see if, in addition to me, there's anyone else you want to meet. Let's get into today's case. This is one I found while I was doing my favorite thing ever, and that is scanning the newspaper archives at newspapers.com. They're actually a sponsor on this episode, but I don't think they know how much they support the show already just by providing their service. Anyway, we'll get to the sponsorships later. We're here to talk about the case. This one takes place in the 1990s in St. Louis. At the center of this case is the Futo family. The patriarch of the family, Emory Futo, was born Emory Futo in Hungary in October 1937. On his 19th birthday in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution began, and to escape the unrest and violence, Emory soon immigrated to the United States, moving in with a cousin named Nicholas, who had already settled in St. Louis. Emory Americanized the pronunciation and the spelling of his first name, going by Emory for the rest of his life. Like a true St. Louisan, he got a job at the Anheuser-Busch Brewery bottling facility. There, he worked as an oiler, which meant he made sure all the moving parts on the machines were well oiled and in good order. In 1964, Emory met Una Bailey, who was the youngest of 7 children, and she was the only girl, 6 older brothers. She grew up in a small town about an hour outside of St. Louis. The two were a bit of an odd couple, with Emory being loud and boisterous, the type of guy you heard over a crowd. And Una, she was much more soft-spoken and pretty shy. But the two married in 1964 after just a few months of dating, when Emory was 26 and Una was 23. In December of that year, Una gave birth to their first son, who they named Emory Michael Futo. From this point on, I'm going to call the father Emory Sr. to avoid confusion. In January of 1968, when little Emory was 3, they had another son they named Nicholas, after Emory's cousin who had taken him in when he fled the war in Hungary. Just 15 months later, in April of 1969, their third and final son, Joseph, was born. Home movies and photographs of the Futo boys show a glimpse of really a picture-perfect family with an active father figure. Emory Sr. was clearly affectionate with his kids, and the home movies from Christmas show the boys in matching pajamas, and then there were the big birthday parties where they invited all of their friends and family, and then they have videos of Emory Sr. playing in the pool with his sons. There were the Little League games and the soccer games, Catholic schools, and church every Sunday. And in 1975, the family bought a newly built home in a nice subdivision, and this was the absolute cliche of the refugee finding the American dream. But that only tells half the story. Pretty much everyone says that Emory Sr. was strict. That was obvious to anyone who spent any amount of time with the family. But many people saw that it went beyond being strict. Like the neighbors who could hear him screaming at his family, and one time, A neighbor saw him chasing his boys down the street with a hockey stick. People knew Emory Sr. was abusive, physically and emotionally to his children, but also to his wife, Una. At least twice, he slapped her in front of people at family events, and he had taken to calling her a stupid Hoosier. Now, I read that part while researching, and it caused me some confusion because I was like, she's not from Indiana. Because I have never heard Hoosier used outside of the context of Indiana. So I Googled Hoosier meaning, and I learned, thanks to Wikipedia, that in St. Louis, it's an insult for someone who is unintelligent or uncultured. And this was one of Emory Sr.'s favorite insults. When Emory Jr. was around 11 or so, he showed up to school with a broken arm. He had a story prepared about how he fell off a bike, but he confided in a friend that his father had thrown him into a bush and he broke his arm as he crashed down. Now, I've been at this long enough that very few things shock me, but I can't help it when I read about so many people knowing abuse was happening and absolutely no one intervened. Una showed up to work with bruises, and the boys went to school in a similar state. The boys would be seen in the emergency room a few times for x-rays and stitches. But except for one relative who told Emory Sr. to stop hitting his wife, it seems everyone was looking the other way. We really have a family, more a father, with two sides here. It was true Emory Sr. spent time having fun with his boys. It's true he bought Una nice things and doted on her at times. But that's when they were doing things the way he wanted them to be done. Otherwise, he would become angry and abusive. And then he would tell them that he loved them after. So you can imagine, I hope you can only imagine, how much that back and forth only added to instability in the home and confusion. Una, who was described as soft-spoken, but clearly also meek and submissive, did little, if anything, to intervene on the abuse happening to her children. And this is a big part of why their firstborn, Emory Jr., left the house as soon as he was old enough. He didn't just have problems at home, but also at school. He dealt with a lot of bullying, and as a result, he transferred high schools twice to escape it. The first two schools were private schools, but then he eventually finished his last 2 years of high school in the public system. As soon as the ink was dry in his diploma, he enlisted in the Navy. It was little surprise that Emory did whatever he had to get out of the family home and away from St. Louis. In December of 1985, while he was stationed in Hawaii, he got married. In the meantime, his younger brothers Nick and Joe were stuck at home. But they didn't have the same issues at school. For them, school provided a bit of a respite from the turmoil at home that it didn't provide for Emory. Nick ended up being held back a year, so he and Joe were in the same grade, and they played soccer for the high school team. They graduated in 1987, and at their graduation party, they had no shortage of friends to invite. After high school, Joe joined the Army Reserves and enrolled at Northeast Missouri University in Kirksville, Missouri. The school has since been renamed Truman State University, but regardless of the name, the purpose of attending there was the same. It was 3 hours away from St. Louis, so it got Joe out of the house, at least during the school year. He was still home for the summers, but he planned on getting his bachelor's degree in political science and then enrolling in the Army's foreign language school. Nick, the middle child, struggled a bit more to find direction after high school. He got a job at a local warehouse, and he lived at home while he figured out what he wanted to do in life. In early 1991, Nick had a relationship fall apart, and he spiraled. He attempted suicide and ended up hospitalized. After this, he recovered physically and emotionally and realized he really did want to have a better future. He started talking about going back to school, and some of this was helped along by a new girlfriend who had encouraged him to work towards more in his life. At the time all of that was happening with Nick, Emory Jr. was living in Riverside, California. He had gotten out of the Navy, and he and his wife settled in California near her family, who were very supportive of them. In July of 1990, they welcomed a son. Emory's visits to St. Louis were few and far between, but his family did travel out to California for the 4th of July weekend in 1991 to celebrate Emory's son's first birthday. The family flew back to St. Louis, assuming that they wouldn't see Emory again for a while. But on July 22, 1991, just weeks later, Emory bought round-trip tickets to St. Louis. He booked them under an assumed name, Jim Clayton, something that you could do back then. It wasn't until 1996 that the U.S. government started requiring IDs for air travel. On July 24th, 1991, Emory called his brother Nick and gave him the incoming flight information, which Nick jotted down. Emory was landing in St. Louis at 6 p.m. on July 25th. The return leg of his journey left St. Louis on the 26th at 6:40 a.m. So he was planning just over 12 hours in Missouri, and most of those hours would be overnight. Emory's intent for traveling to St. Louis would later become a matter of dispute. He called into work saying that he was sick and couldn't come in, but he told his wife he was actually going camping with a friend named George. He even loaded up his camping gear into George's vehicle. Now, George obviously knew they weren't going camping, but he was willing to cover for his friend. Emory had told him he had to go back to Missouri to help his brother Nick with something, and whatever it was, he didn't want his wife to know about it. George knew Nick had previously attempted suicide, so he thought it might have to do with that. So instead of going camping, George dropped Emory off at the airport. Then, knowing that his wife and Emory's wife might talk, he made plans to just stay out all night until it was time to pick Emory up again the next day. On July 25th, as Emory was flying to St. Louis, Nick went to work as usual. He was scheduled to leave at 5:30, and shortly before he left for the day, he asked a coworker if this coworker would go buy a mallet and a pillow for him. Those seemed like really random items, but Nick gave the coworker the money, and the coworker did Nick the favor. Nick had these items when he got off work, and his girlfriend, who we're going to call Jennifer, saw them. She asked why he had them, and he said that Emory had asked him to pick them up. Nick had previously told Jennifer that Emory was flying into town because he had a $200,000 cocaine deal he was doing. Nick was supposed to pick Emory up at the airport, bring him to the location for the drug deal, and then drop him back off at the airport afterwards. To be prepared in case anything went wrong, Emory had mailed Nick a disassembled gun, which had arrived on the 20th, and Jennifer knew about that. So Nick picked Emory up from the airport at 6 as planned, and then around 8 p.m., Nick talked to Jennifer on the phone. She asked him if the drug deal was done yet, and he said no, they hadn't gone. He then said he would call her around midnight because he anticipated being done by then, but he never called. The next day, Friday, July 26th, Una did not show up for work. A coworker called her neighbor to see if anything had happened, and the neighbor went to knock on the Futo's door. Though Una and Emory Sr.'s cars were there, no one answered. The police were then called, but they drove by the house and seeing nothing suspicious, they left. Then Emory Sr. didn't show up for his job. He was expected there at 3 p.m. since he worked the second shift. Reaching out to family, they found a cousin of Emory's in the area who accompanied the police to the house at 4:30. Once inside, they found that the house had been ransacked. Things weren't just tossed around. Things were broken. Nearly every framed family picture was taken off the wall and smashed. We're talking around 8 to 10 photo frames total. As the police made their way through the home, in the hallway near the back bedroom, they found the body of 50-year-old Una Bailey Futo. And there was blood everywhere. She had been struck in the head at least 5 times, sending blood spatter up onto the walls. She also had an electrical cord around her neck, and there was evidence she had been dragged by that cord. After the main floor was cleared, the officers headed to the basement. And that's where they found 53-year-old Emory Futo Sr. He had not been beaten to death, but rather he was stabbed 4 times and shot 3 times with a .38. The fatal wound would be determined to be a stab wound to the chest that pierced his heart. Between the beating of Una and the overkill of Emory Sr. and the state of the house, whatever happened was clearly done in a rage. The cousin who had been at the house with the police told them that there should have been 2 other people there. 23-year-old Nick, who lived there in the house full-time, and 22-year-old Joe, who was home from college. So the investigators were eager to determine their whereabouts. Were they victims too, or were they suspects? At that point, it seemed it could go either way. They had an answer pretty quickly in regards to Nick Futo. At just about the same time the police were making entry into the family home, maintenance workers at the New St. Marcus Cemetery were heading out to the dumpster to throw away some trash. The dumpster is down a walking path, and it's tucked into some woods behind the cemetery. And on that path, they found the body of a young man lying face down. It was Nick. Nick had been killed by a gunshot wound to the back of his head, though he was then shot 3 more times, twice in the back and once on the right side of his face. The investigators believe that the shot to the back of the head was the initial shot, and the other 3 were done when he was already lying on the ground. Nick had been shot, like his father, with a .38. In his pocket, the police found the piece of paper that he had written down Emory's flight number on. But of course, at this point, the investigators didn't know the significance. To them, it was just a random flight number. A search of the area did not help them locate Joe. But they did find a pillow with Nick's blood on it in the dumpster, and the pillow looked new. It was likely the one Nick had his coworker buy that day, and possibly it was being used as an attempt at a silencer. Have you ever wondered why breaking a good habit is pretty easy, but breaking a bad habit feels nearly impossible? Sometimes it's easier not to give up the bad habit, but rather change it. And I want to thank Fume for sponsoring this episode. Fume will take your habit and make it better and a whole lot more enjoyable. Fume is an innovative, award-winning flavored air device. And instead of using vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses delicious flavors. This is a habit you can enjoy, and it makes replacing your bad habit easier. I didn't really know what to expect when I got the Fume, but I have to say, the taste of Fume was really refreshing. So if you think of vapor as like a sticky soda, Fume flavors are more like an herbal tea. They feel a lot more natural and refreshing. And if you're like me and you lose everything, don't worry. Fume has recently released a magnetic stand. And not only does it keep your Fume in one place, you can also fidget with it, spinning your Fume around. So start the year off right with the good habit by going to tryfume.com/crimelines and getting the journey pack today. Fume is giving listeners of the show 10% off when they use my code crimelines to help make starting the good habit that much easier. Today's podcast is brought to you by newspapers.com, the ultimate destination for exploring the mysteries of the past and the greatest contributor to the making of this podcast. If you're fascinated by true crime, get ready to dive into the stories that made headlines. Newspapers.com offers nearly 1 billion pages of historical newspapers from the U.S. and beyond, and you can search for the entire collection in seconds. Their vast newspaper collection is a goldmine for eyewitness accounts, crime scene photos, news reports, and more. Whether you're interested in famous cases or long-forgotten cases, Newspapers.com gives you a front row seat to more than 300 years of history. For my listeners, Newspapers.com has a special offer. Use the code CRIMELINES for an exclusive 20% discount on your subscription. That's promo code CRIMELINES at Newspapers.com. Sign up today and join me in starting to unravel the true crime mysteries that keep you up at night. It was while canvassing the Futo's neighborhood hours after the bodies were found that the police came across a red Mustang that matched the description of Joe's vehicle. It was parked about a block from the family home behind a small business, and there was a note on the car asking the owner not to park there in the future. In the back seat of the car, under some trash bags, was Joe Futo's body. Like his brother and his father, he had been shot with a .38. In contacting the owner of the business where the car was parked, he said that the car was there when he got to work at 6:30 that morning, and he was the one who left a note on the car. But he had not noticed that there was a body there because it was covered. So we have 4 out of 5 members of a single family who had been killed at 3 different crime scenes. When the investigators asked about the surviving son, the cousins told the police that he wasn't in the area as he lived in California. And these cousins, Frank and Betty, did try to call Emory and let him know that his family was dead, but they couldn't reach him until some point on Saturday when they called over to his in-laws' house. Emory's cousin Betty told him that his parents and his brothers were dead. She was breaking the news to him a step at a time. First, that they were dead. Let him have a second to process that. And then she would answer what would surely be his follow-up question. How did they die? But instead, Emory's follow-up question was, do they think I killed them? This took Betty aback because she had very intentionally not said they were murdered right away. Yet that's immediately what he jumped to. Not a house fire or a car crash. He went right to, do they think I killed them? Betty reported this to the police, who had already started suspecting Emory. For one thing, remember how the house was ransacked and almost all of the pictures were smashed? I mean, the wall was just a bunch of nails sticking out from where the pictures had hung. All except one. The only photo not smashed was the one of Emory's son. Beyond that, they knew Emory had been in St. Louis at the time of the murders. When I was structuring this episode, I considered withholding the information about Emory coming to St. Louis to build in a little intrigue and mystery, but that would have been artificial because there was no intrigue and mystery for the investigators. And that's because Nick's girlfriend, Jennifer, she told the police immediately that Nick was picking Emory up from the airport. Even the newspaper reports from the day after the bodies were found said that Emory had been in town. This was no bombshell. And then when Emory's friend George heard about the murders, he called the police to let them know that he was the one who dropped Emory off at the airport on Thursday and picked him up on Friday, and that he covered for him with his wife. The investigators put an APB out for Nick's car, which was still missing, and it was found around 4:30 in the morning on Saturday the 27th. It was parked about 2 miles from the airport, and the investigators learned that a man fitting Emory's description called a cab service at 2:47 a.m. on Friday from a nearby Denny's restaurant. The man gave his name as Jim and said he was heading to the airport to meet some friends from Florida. Jim, a.k.a. Emory, asked to be brought to Coco's restaurant, which was just about 2 blocks from the airport. There, he ordered some breakfast, and the server said that Emory seemed to be in a hurry, and he smelled of body odor. After he paid his tab, Emory headed over to the airport and got on his flight back to California. All of these details that came out in the early part of the investigation only bolstered what the investigators knew on day 1 of the investigation. And that was that Emory's family members were all confirmed to be alive when he landed in St. Louis. And by the time he left, they were all dead. At the request of the police in St. Louis, Emory's local police in California showed up at his house on Saturday to ask him some questions. Emory, who had no idea how much evidence the police back home already had, denied that he had even been to St. Louis. He said he hadn't been there in over a year. He stuck to his story that he and his friend went camping. Knowing Emory was a suspect, they read him his Miranda rights, and that's when Emory said he wanted an attorney, and the police said, okay. And then they took him into custody on suspicion of murder. The next day, the St. Louis police flew out to California to get started on charging Emory and extraditing him to Missouri. When Emory found out they were there, he said he wanted to talk to them. They read him his Miranda rights again, and then he made a statement. Emory started by admitting he lied to the initial officers, and he said he did fly to St. Louis. He said that Nick was in trouble, something relating to a drug deal, and he was going out there to help him out. He said that they went to the new St. Marcus Cemetery and walked back to the wooded area where they were supposed to meet with whoever Nick was dealing with. Emory said he heard gunshots and got scared, so he took off, taking Nick's car with him. He said he drove towards the airport, parked the car, and then called a cab. Emory denied that he had been to his parents' house, and he said he didn't know what happened to them or to Joe. The investigator said, well, if he hadn't been to the house in over a year, then they wouldn't find his fingerprints there, and the bloody footprint left by the killer wouldn't match his shoes. Emory had nothing more to say to this, so he went back to his cell for about 20 minutes. He had thought over the information about the prints and said he wanted to talk again. This time he had story number 2. In this story, he said that after he fled from the cemetery after hearing the shots, he didn't drive straight to the airport. He went to his parents' house where he found them dead. In a panic, he drove to the airport, parked the car, took the cab. He didn't really have a good explanation for why he never called the police after finding his parents dead, and he claimed he didn't know who had killed them. Now, this story didn't make much more sense than the first one, so then Emory came up with story number 3 shortly after. He kept framing this as he had left parts out or had forgotten pieces, but this new story was drastically different than the previous ones and, to a large degree, contradicted them. Emory said that after Nick picked him up at the airport, they drove around for a few hours until it was dark. They then went to their parents' home where Nick gave him some latex gloves. On entering the house, Nick confronted Una and hit her with a mallet, likely the 4.5-pound one he had the coworker buy that day. After Una was dead, they left the house and met up with Joe at a snow cone stand. The 3 brothers piled into Joe's Mustang, and for some reason, Joe got into the back seat of his own car, with Emory driving and Nick in the passenger seat. They drove around while Nick told Joe what he had done to their mother. Joe freaked out when he heard this, so Nick pulled out a gun and shot Joe. They covered his body with bags and dumped the car behind the store. They then got into Nick's car and went back to the house to wait on Emory Sr. to get home. He left work around midnight, so it would have been between 12:15 and 12:30 that he walked through the front door. Once he was inside, Nick came out from where he was hiding and shot Emory multiple times. As for how he got into the basement, that was a little fuzzy. Maybe he fell down the stairs after stumbling around, or maybe he went down there on purpose to try to shield himself. All he said to his son was, "Why?" Emory said both he and Nick left the house at this point, but they came back to make sure their father was dead. Nick stabbed him a few times, and then Emory kicked him to see if he would respond, but he didn't. The investigators listened to this story with several questions swirling, but the obvious one was, if Nick supposedly killed everyone else, who killed Nick? Emory answered this by saying that after Nick killed their father, they left the house and drove to the cemetery. They made a pact that Emory was to shoot Nick, and then he was going to take his own life. After shooting Nick, he tried to turn the gun on himself, but he just couldn't do it. So he left, heading towards the airport, stopping only to throw the gun in the river. Under more questioning, little parts of Emory's story started changing and shifting, and eventually it had moved to how there was a suicide pact between him and Nick before Emory ever got there. He flew to St. Louis knowing that they were going to die together. So that led to the very obvious question on the part of the investigators. Why, if he was planning on suicide, did he buy a round-trip ticket? And that was the end of this round of questioning. It seemed like Emory would talk and talk and talk until he got stumped for an explanation, and then he'd stop talking, taking time to formulate a new story to fit the information. 26-year-old Emory Futo was initially charged with just the murder of his brother Nick, with charges for the rest of the murders pending the results of the investigation. They could prove Emory killed Nick since he confessed to it. As for his father, mother, and other brother, he was still insisting he wasn't the one who did it. Nick was. And while that seemed improbable, they had to make sure it was beyond a reasonable doubt before they took Emory to trial. An issue here was that a lot of the evidence against Emory applied to Nick as well. They knew from a coworker of Emory's that he was looking for a cheap .38 caliber gun that he didn't want registered in his name. His coworker told him he could help get him a gun, but it would have to be registered in Emory's name since that was the law. So Emory then went to a neighbor and asked if he knew how to get an unregistered gun. The neighbor said he didn't know, but he did have a registered gun for sale. It was more money than Emory wanted to spend, and again, he wanted a gun that wouldn't be traced back to anyone. In late June, he told the neighbor the gun situation had been taken care of. On July 19th, Emory mailed a package weighing 3 pounds, 11 ounces to his brother Nick. That package was delivered the same day Nick told his girlfriend that his brother had sent him pieces to a gun. So yes, Emory was looking for an unregistered gun, and then he sent one in the mail. But it's confirmed to have been received by Nick. As for the mallet, believed to be used to kill Una, Nick told his girlfriend that he needed it for his brother, but there's no evidence he ever gave it to Emory. If anything, it looked like Nick may have been in on some murder plot with Emory. And when someone is in on the plot, how do you prove they weren't the one who committed the crime? The investigators believed the answer to that was in the witness timeline of the night. And they believe this timeline proved that Nick was dead before Emory Sr. ever got home from work. Near the cemetery where Nick's body was found is an apartment complex. If this apartment complex was any closer to the cemetery, it would be in the cemetery. Around 9 p.m. on the night of the murders, multiple residents heard gunshots coming from the location of the cemetery. About 15 to 20 minutes later, a red Mitsubishi Eclipse, which is what Nick drove, was seen by a witness pulling into the entrance of the complex. There was only one person in the car, and he fit Emory's description more than he fit Nick's. While we tend not to remember every car that drives by, this one was noticed because the man sat in the car for about 5 minutes, just staring at the woods in the direction of the cemetery. It's 9 at night, you just heard gunshots, and then an unfamiliar man in an unfamiliar car is just sitting there. That's the sort of thing you make a mental note of. And this is where the next witness picks things up. At some point between 9:30 and 10:30 that night, a neighbor of the Futos named Teresa went out to her car and noticed that there was a man in a red Mitsubishi parked on the other side of the road. He seemed frazzled as he was going through papers. Teresa didn't recognize him, so after she went back inside her house, she looked out the window a few times just to see what he was up to. He was in the car for about 20 to 30 minutes, as far as she could tell. When Teresa heard about the murders and that the police were looking for a red Mitsubishi Eclipse, she told them what she saw. She would then later identify the man she saw as Emory, and again, he had been alone in the car. So we have shots at the cemetery at 9 p.m., followed by at least 2 witnesses who saw Emory alone in Nick's car. It looked like Nick was dead at that point, so he couldn't have killed his father since his father was alive and well at work. Today's podcast is brought to you by newspapers.com, the ultimate destination for exploring the mysteries of the past and the greatest contributor to the making of this podcast. If you're fascinated by true crime, get ready to dive into the stories that made headlines. Newspapers.com offers nearly 1 billion pages of historical newspapers from the U.S. and beyond, and you can search for the entire collection in seconds. Their vast newspaper collection is a goldmine for eyewitness accounts, crime scene photos, news reports, and more. Whether you're interested in famous cases or long-forgotten cases, newspapers.com gives you a front row seat to more than 300 years of history. For my listeners, newspapers.com has a special offer. Use the code CRIMELINES for an exclusive 20% discount on your subscription. That's promo code CRIMELINES at newspapers.com. Sign up today and join me in starting to unravel the true crime mysteries that keep you up at night. I love a good digital calendar because everyone can sync to it, add things. It keeps my life as a mom very organized, but nobody looks at it. So I like paper calendars so that everyone is looking at it because it's right there in the living room. But it's not very convenient because I can't add things to it from my phone. So thankfully, Skylight Calendar has come up with a solution. Skylight Calendar is a smart touchscreen calendar and organizer for all your chores, groceries, to-do lists, and it's a great way to manage appointments to make sure they never overlap and they're never missed. It helps keep busy households on track and everyone on the same page so families can get time back for moments that matter. The Skylight Calendar will sync from all of your existing family calendars, Google, Apple, Outlook, but you can also add things directly to the Skylight Calendar using their mobile app or the touchscreen. Using Skylight Calendar's mobile app is the way to go because then you always have access to your calendar. And it wouldn't be me if I didn't mention the chore chart, which lets you know what is being done, but more importantly, what's not being done. And unlike a cluttered paper calendar, when this calendar is not in use, you can turn it into a digital picture frame. As a special limited time offer for my listeners, get 15% off your purchase of a Skylight calendar when you go to skylightcal.com/crimelines. That's skylightcal.com/crimelines. Mother's Day is coming right up, so order today and get 15% off your purchase at skylightcal.com/crimelines. The police also suspected, based on the timeline Emory himself gave, that Nick may have been dead even before Una. Emory said that they waited until after dark to go to the house. This was late July. The sun doesn't set until about 8:20, and then it's not dark until closer to 9:30. Now imagine if Emory was telling the truth about that one detail of his story, that it was dark before Una was killed. This little detail was just one more thing that told the investigators that Emory was the killer of all four. They took their evidence to a grand jury in late July 1991, and Emory was indicted on all four murders. And as they prepared for trial, the state started exploring the motive. Based on what people who knew the family said, the state absolutely believed that Emory Sr. was abusive. And that abuse that he inflicted on his family was probably the source of the rage Emory Jr. had. They were not going to try to dispute that at trial. But the question was, why take out his entire family? Maybe he also had rage for his mother who didn't protect him, but his younger brothers? What did he gain from their deaths? The state believed the answer was money. Emory found himself in a bit of a financial bind. He made enough money to support a family of three, making $60,000 a year. For some reference, in California in 1991, the average personal income was just under $21,000. So $60,000 a year was solid. But Emory recently bought a house near the very top price of what he could get a mortgage for. He also had a new Corvette, which obviously wasn't cheap, and he was frankly living a lifestyle he couldn't afford. There was evidence that he was borrowing money from his father, but his father had recently told him no more. Angry about both the abuse and being cut off, Emory wanted to kill his parents. But to fix the latter problem, the money issue, his brothers would also have to die, or else the inheritance would be divided 3 ways. So to get all of the $350,000 life insurance policy, plus proceeds from liquidating the estate, Emory plotted to kill them all, and it started with lying to Nick about why he was coming to town in the first place. As this was a quadruple homicide for financial gain, the state decided to ask for a death sentence. Emory Futo's trial began on Monday, February 1st, 1993, a year and a half after his family had been killed. And the prosecution went hard. They told the jury that Emory was a man living a big life who hated his father for a childhood of abuse, but more important to Emory was that he needed money. They said hours after Nick picked Emory up at the airport, the two went out to the cemetery because that's where Emory told Nick the drug deal would take place. But it was all a ruse to get his brother alone in an isolated place so he could kill him. Then Emory left Nick's body there and went to meet up with Joe, killing him and leaving him in his car. It was only then that he went to his parents' house and killed his mother before waiting for his father to get home after midnight. The state had a number of witnesses against Emory, including his cousins from his father's side. One cousin, Frank, went to talk to Emory after he was extradited to St. Louis, and Frank asked him, "Just tell the truth." And Emory then had a new story for Frank. He stuck to Nick being the killer, but this time he said he wasn't there when it happened. Frank pushed, and then Emory changed his story and admitted he was there, but still, Nick was the one who killed everyone. Frank, who knew he wasn't getting the truth, told Emory, once again, to just tell him what really happened, and Emory replied, "What, tell the truth and be convicted of 4 murders?" He then said telling the truth would mean a death sentence. The defense, though, stuck with Emory's story that Nick killed their parents and their brother. He was the one who had the gun, he had the mallet, and, according to the defense, he had the disposition for violence. They called a witness to undermine the state's timeline, someone saying that they saw Nick alive at 10:30 p.m., long after the shots from the cemetery were heard. Emory then took the stand in his own defense. Though he still claimed Nick killed the family, he did have a new story, unlike what he had previously told the police. He was asked why his stories kept changing, and he said he didn't mean to lie. He had blocked out a lot of it, and it was coming back in pieces. Like when he denied going to St. Louis, his brain had blocked out the entire trip. Emory testified tearfully about the abuse his family suffered at the hands of his father, and he said it wasn't just physical and mental and verbal abuse, it was also sexual abuse. He claimed Emory Sr. had sexually abused all 3 boys, and while he had never told anyone that before, one of his cousins has since come out and said Emory Sr. had sexually abused her as well. Now, as for the murders, Emory said he flew to St. Louis to help Nick out because Nick owed money to some pretty bad guys. The plan was to meet up with them and settle things. So Emory used a fake name when he booked his airline ticket just in case things went south. He didn't want it to be known he was in the area if something bad did happen. Emory said that after Nick picked him up from the airport, they drove around a bit and talked about their childhood. They talked about their issues with their father, and then they moved on to talk about Nick's newer problems. At some point that night, probably 10:30 or later, Emory said he dropped Nick off at home, and then he went to a parking lot of an apartment complex while he waited on Nick. They were going to then meet up with the people Nick owed money to at the cemetery after midnight. Emory waited there for nearly 2 hours before Nick showed up. He had a gym bag that he put in the back seat before he then got into the passenger seat. They drove out to the woods near the cemetery and started walking towards the meeting spot. As they walked, Nick told Emory that, quote, "Joe is sleeping. Nobody's ever going to hurt Joe again." And then Nick told him that he had shot Joe while he was in the back seat of his car. And then he said he had hit Eula to make her go to sleep, before then shooting Emory Sr. when he came home from work. Nick had the gun with him, and fearing he was next, Emory reached for it. They fought over the gun before Emory got control of it, firing at Nick in self-defense. Leaving Nick on the path in the cemetery, Emory ran back to the car and drove to the family home to see if what Nick said was true. There he found their parents dead, and afraid he was going to be blamed for it as the last man standing, he didn't call the police. He threw the gun and the mallet off the I-70 bridge into the Missouri River and then went back to California. After getting there, he went back to work on Friday afternoon, telling his boss he was feeling better. He then blocked out the entire trip from his mind, and the defense even called psychological experts to talk about Emory's ability to dissociate from reality as a result of his childhood abuse. It was a survival mechanism that he brought into adulthood. The state, in their closing argument, pointed out all the moments of premeditation, and didn't it make more sense that Emory knew something terrible was going to happen for him to go to these extremes? He got an unregistered gun, which took him some time to get, disassembled it, and mailed it. He booked a ticket under another name. He called in sick to work while telling his wife he was going camping. This was a lot of planning and lying in all of this if he was just going there to help his brother with something that may or may not go bad. The jury took the case and they deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before they came back with 4 verdicts of guilty for the murders of Emory, Eula, Nick, and Joe Futo. As for the sentencing phase, they spent 2 hours deliberating before giving the sentence recommendation of life in prison rather than the death penalty. And surely the testimony about his abusive father influenced this. At the formal sentencing hearing, the judge did have the final say on the sentence. Emory maintained his innocence, though the judge said there was no doubt of his guilt. He acknowledged the childhood abuse Emory suffered and then gave him 4 consecutive life terms without parole. Emory appealed his conviction, and in March 1996, against all odds, it was granted. His attorney had argued successfully that there was a trial error when the judge would not allow Emory to talk to his attorney during recesses, and that included recesses that occurred during his cross-examination. This error was significant enough that his conviction was overturned and Emory went back on trial in September 1997. The evidence given was pretty much the same. Nothing really new came out except that the state was more prepared for Nick to be thrown under the bus. So they really played up this idea that he was a patsy from the jump. Nick was just a guy who trusted that his big brother meant him no harm and ended up helping his own murderer. Something interesting in this new trial was that the jury could not know about the previous trial or the verdict. So they had no idea how or why the timeline jumped from a 1991 arrest to a 1997 trial. Previous testimony was barred from being used in this trial except as impeachment evidence. And I think that might be a big reason why Emory didn't take the stand this time. The state wouldn't really argue over a witness changing their testimony a little bit over the years, but if Emory took the stand and said anything contradictory at all, it would just be opening the door to let the previous testimony in, and the jury may figure out this wasn't the first trial. Other than Emory not testifying, the trial was not a lot different than the first, and neither was the outcome. A juror later said that their deliberation wasn't so much over guilt or innocence, but really on premeditation. They wavered a bit between first and second degree before finding Emory guilty of 4 charges of first-degree murder. And again, they recommended 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, which is what the judge gave him. With Emory giving multiple stories and there being 2 trials, people still weren't satisfied that the truth came out. There were articles and op-eds for years debating what Emory's true motive was, since it still didn't make sense that he killed his brothers. The state said it was about the money, but the people who knew Emory just could not see that being the motivation. Emory and his brothers, particularly Emory and Nick, had been close, and he protected them, even when it meant Emory Sr. would turn on him. Most of the articles concluded by saying we will never really know the truth. That was until August of 2020, when Emory Futo decided to set the record straight and told probably the most true account he has given thus far. Nearly 30 years had passed, and from behind bars, the 56-year-old inmate had read an article about the killings. He decided it was time to talk, and he called Bob Cyphers, a reporter with First Alert 4 in St. Louis, in order to get his story out there. Emory talked to Bob about the abuse he and his brother suffered, saying it started when he was around 5, and by the time he was 8, he started sleeping with a knife under his pillow, at least until his parents found it and took it away. He said the abuse was mental and physical, but the worst of the abuse was sexual. The sexual abuse ended as he got older, and the physical abuse stopped when Emory got big enough to fight back. But he still took his first chance to leave the house when he joined the Navy. And pretty much every time Emory came home while on leave, which wasn't often, there would be some type of confrontation between him and his father. He admitted that he threatened his father's life at least twice, telling him that if he didn't stop putting his hands on his mother and his brothers, he was going to kill him. Emory acknowledged that his mother was an abused woman, but he admitted his anger and resentment weren't just at his father, but also at her. She not only never stopped the abuse, she would do whatever Emory Sr. told her to do, even when it enabled the abuse of her children. Emory acknowledged that his mother was an abused woman, but he admitted his anger and resentment weren't just at his father, but also at her. She not only never stopped the abuse, she would do whatever Emory Sr. told her to do, even when it enabled the abuse of her children. Though Emory distanced himself from his parents and got counseling for his own anger issues, he never cut them off completely. They were thrilled to become grandparents, and Emory invited them to his son's first birthday party. Emory said that the plans for killing his parents really stemmed from that visit. His parents were alone in a room with his son, and Emory walked in. He would not say what he saw when he walked into that room, though the implication was that it may have been sexual abuse. Whatever it was, it triggered a memory of his own childhood. He believed he had just put his son at risk by allowing his parents to be around him, and that he wasn't even able to protect his own son in his own home. Emory said he snapped and kicked his parents out of his house. He told them to never contact him again. Nick came out to visit Emory right after that, and Emory told him what happened. They started talking about their own childhood, and they decided that they needed to protect the next generation. That's when they made the plan, together, to kill their parents. Now, I'm going to say that Emory has literally nothing to gain from lying at this point. He's not getting out of jail, and he knows that. But I want to point out that there were 2 witnesses who said Emory was looking for an unregistered gun about a month before his parents' visit to his house and before this triggering event happened. I just want to interject that real quick. Let's get back to Emory's story. After Emory and Nick decided to kill Emory Sr. and Una, Emory called their other brother Joe. Joe and Emory hadn't talked in a little bit, but Emory told him what happened with his son and what he and Nick were going to do. And it was Emory's understanding that all 3 brothers were in agreement. Emory would fly to St. Louis under a fake name and kill their parents while he had an alibi of camping in California. Again, while I'm acknowledging that Emory has nothing to gain by lying at this point, I have to wonder why Nick told his girlfriend that Emory was going to be in town at all if Nick knew this was supposed to be covert. Anyway, when Emory got into town, he and Nick went to a fast food restaurant to eat, and Nick told him there was a problem with their plan. Joe was out. Not only did he not want anything to do with the plot, he was saying that the stories Nick and Emory swapped about their childhood abuse were not true. So the 2 then drove to meet up with Joe and talk to him. Immediately, Joe started saying nothing happened to them and he didn't want to talk about it. For Emory, though, this wasn't just about what happened when they were kids, so much as protecting his own child. And now the person he had protected all those years ago was saying it never happened. Their verbal argument turned physical, and Nick had to break them up. When he did, Joe hopped into his car and left. Emory said he grabbed Nick's keys and followed him. When they stopped again, the two picked up their argument. Emory said he wasn't in his right mind when Joe said that he would tell the police if Emory did anything to their parents. So he shot Joe and put his body in the back seat, covering it with trash bags. Emory then drove back to where he had left Nick. Emory said that Nick had been on the phone with his girlfriend and seemed to be ready to back out as well. And we know Nick talked to his girlfriend at about 8 p.m., so this fits with the known timeline. Nick asked where Joe was, and Emory said Joe took off and it was up to the two of them. Nick pointed out the obvious. If Joe was out, he was going to warn their parents or maybe even go to the police with what they planned. So Nick and Emory got into Nick's car, and for some reason they went to the cemetery. Nick just kept bringing up Joe, and Emory realized he was no longer an accomplice, he was a liability. So from behind, Emory shot him in the head and then shot him a few more times. He said he knelt by Nick's body and cried. This is confirming that the shots the witnesses heard were from when Nick was killed, just like the state theorized. My guess is that Emory parked by the apartment where he was seen to see if the police would be called on the report of shots fired, and when they weren't, he left and drove to his parents' house. At this point, Emory had come to town to kill 2 people, but he ended up killing 2 different people. But he wasn't going to leave until he finished the task he went there to do. This is a spot where the timeline breaks down a bit because Emory said his mother wasn't home from work yet. She worked at a bank, so I can't imagine her coming home that late, so maybe she had come from somewhere else. Emory said he caught his mother by surprise and killed her before she really had time to react. He pulled her body down the hall so his father wouldn't immediately see it when he came in. He then waited a few hours for his father to get home. Emory Sr. came home around 12:20 and took the dog out for a quick walk. He came back, flipped on the light, and saw Emory standing there. Emory said his father didn't seem surprised to see him, and according to Emory, he knew why he was there. He said his father said, "I knew this day was coming, I just hoped it wouldn't." And then Emory shot him. Again, he has no motive to lie at this point, but that dramatic line really sounds like it's out of a movie. I think his previous story about his father's last words being, "Why?" makes a lot more sense. Anyway, Emory said he knew the police would figure it out and arrest him, so he just went home and tried to act normal while waiting for the investigators to show up on his doorstep. And with this story, which will be linked in my sources, Emory Futo finally admitted that he killed his family, and his brother Nick did not. But Emory still insists the motive had nothing to do with any sort of inheritance. He did not go there planning to kill his brothers. Things just went sideways when they got cold feet. But the murders of his parents were planned, not just as retaliation for the abuse, but according to Emory, to prevent it from happening to anyone else. While I did point out a few issues with the story, I think this is, on the whole, a truthful account of what happened on the night of July 25th, 1991. And Emory came forward to clear his brother's name after spending so many years blaming him for something he didn't do. And for the surviving extended family, hopefully this gave them some answers to questions they had. And for other people out there in other cases who are still waiting for an explanation, I hope this gives you hope that one day those answers may come. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basement4productions.com/support.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you Fargo? You can in the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.